Richard Westbrook was a man of considerable wealth and influence, known for his sharp business acumen and even sharper wit. He had built a life of luxury and prestige, yet it was a life marked by solitude and detachment. Rarely did he mingle with those outside his social class, and when he did, it was with the same detached precision he applied to everything else. But one particular evening, Richard found himself unexpectedly intrigued. Working quietly in the background of his expansive estate was Sophie Taylor, a housekeeper who had been part of his household staff for several years. Sophie was diligent, composed, and carried herself with quiet dignity, something Richard couldn't help but notice, though he never admitted it. On this particular day, as he reviewed his latest business dealings in his study, a whimsical, almost absurd thought crossed his mind that he couldn't shake. Richard decided to invite Sophie to dinner, not as an equal or out of courtesy, but as an experiment of sorts. He was curious to observe her outside the context of her duties, wondering if her composed exterior would falter in an unfamiliar setting. Later that evening, Richard called for Sophie. Standing in his immaculate office, he extended the invitation in his typically impassive manner. "Sophie, I'd like you to join me for dinner tomorrow evening. It's an opportunity to discuss your future here." His words were carefully measured, designed to sound both formal and vaguely significant. Sophie, caught off guard, hesitated before replying. She had spent years maintaining a professional distance from Richard, knowing her place in the rigid hierarchy of his world. Yet his invitation stirred a mix of apprehension and curiosity within her. With a polite nod, she accepted. The following evening, Sophie arrived at the dining room dressed simply yet elegantly in a modest black dress. She had spent extra time preparing, not out of vanity, but out of a desire to present herself with the same dignity she always carried. As she stepped into the grand room, Richard looked up from his seat, momentarily taken aback by her composed presence. He gestured for her to sit, masking his surprise with a cool indifference. The dinner began with an awkward silence, the only sound coming from the occasional clinking of silverware. Richard, determined to steer the conversation, asked a series of questions designed to keep Sophie on her toes, but to his surprise, her responses were thoughtful and articulate, laced with a quiet humor that disarmed him. She spoke not as a servant, but as a person of depth and intelligence. Richard found himself drawn into the conversation. Sophie spoke of her upbringing, the challenges she had faced, and the dreams she still held close to her heart. Her words carried a weight that contrasted sharply with the shallow banter he was accustomed to at high society gatherings. For the first time in years, Richard felt genuinely engaged. As the evening wore on, Richard's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Sophie's presence was unlike anything he had expected. She was not intimidated by his status, nor did she seek his approval. She was simply herself, graceful, resilient, and unyieldingly honest. It was a revelation that left Richard both captivated and unsettled. The next morning, Richard woke with thoughts of Sophie lingering in his mind. Her words, her demeanor, and the way she had carried herself during their conversation replayed in his head. He found himself questioning the assumptions he had long held about people in her position, assumptions he now realized were born of ignorance. Throughout the day, Richard tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts drifted back to Sophie. He wondered if she had felt the same strange connection he had experienced. Sophie, meanwhile, returned to her duties with the same quiet professionalism she always displayed. But beneath her calm exterior, she couldn't ignore the impact of the dinner. She had seen a side of Richard that few likely ever had, a vulnerability hidden beneath his aloof facade. It made her curious, though she remained cautious. Over the following weeks, Richard found reasons to interact with Sophie more often. He lingered in the kitchen while she prepared meals, asked her opinion on trivial matters, and even sought her out in the garden where she often spent her evenings. These moments, though brief, became a source of unexpected comfort for him. Sophie noticed his efforts, but remained guarded. She appreciated his interest, but was wary of his intentions. She had spent years navigating the unspoken rules of her position, and she knew how easily such dynamics could shift. Yet, she couldn't deny the warmth she felt in his presence, a warmth that defied logic. One evening, Richard invited Sophie to join him for a walk in the garden. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the estate as they strolled among the neatly manicured hedges. For the first time, Richard opened up about his own life. He spoke of his lonely childhood, the pressures of inheriting a vast fortune, and the emptiness that often accompanied his success. Sophie listened intently, her empathy evident in her eyes. She shared her own story of growing up in a modest household, the sacrifices made to support her family, and the quiet pride she took in her work. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, breaking down the barriers that had once separated them. As their bond deepened, Richard began to see the world through Sophie's eyes. He became aware of the prejudices and judgments she faced, even within his own household. This realization ignited a protective instinct within him, as well as a determination to challenge the biases that had long gone unchecked in his world. But not everyone approved of their growing closeness. Richard's longtime business associate, Thomas Harrison, noticed the change in him and voiced his disapproval. During a business gathering, Thomas made a snide remark about Richard's unusual company, his tone dripping with condescension. Richard's response was swift and unequivocal. "Sophie is more than capable of holding her own in any room, Thomas. Perhaps it's you who should reassess your perspective." The confrontation left Richard more determined than ever to stand by Sophie, regardless of the societal expectations that sought to keep them apart. Sophie, too, faced challenges as rumors of their relationship spread. Friends and colleagues warned her of the potential consequences. Despite her growing feelings for Richard, she grappled with fears of losing her independence and the life she had worked so hard to build. One evening, she voiced her concerns to Richard. "I don't want to lose myself in this," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I need to know that I can still be me." Richard took her hands in his gaze unwavering. "Sophie, I don't want to change who you are. I want to support you, to help you achieve your dreams on your terms." His words reassured her, and together they began to navigate the complexities of their relationship with care and respect. Months later, Sophie's dream of opening a community center became a reality. With Richard's quiet support and her unwavering determination, the center grew into a vibrant hub of hope and opportunity for underprivileged families. On the day of its grand opening, Sophie stood at the entrance, welcoming guests with a radiant smile. Richard watched from a distance, his heart swelling with pride as the ceremony began. As the ceremony continued, Sophie spoke with heartfelt conviction about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thanked everyone who had supported her vision, and her words resonated deeply with all who heard them. That evening, as they walked through the garden, Richard turned to Sophie. "You've created something incredible here," he said softly, "and I'm honored to have been a part of it." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me, Richard," she said, "for standing by me, even when it wasn't easy." Their journey had been far from simple, but it had been worth every challenge. Together, they had built not only a love that defied conventions, but also a legacy that would continue to inspire others for years to come. The months following the community center's opening were a whirlwind of activity and growth. Sophie dedicated herself fully to the project, balancing her work at Richard's estate with the demands of managing the center. The center had become a beacon of hope in the community, offering after-school programs for children, vocational training for adults, and a safe space for families in need. Meanwhile, Richard became more involved in the center than he had originally anticipated. What had started as a gesture of support for Sophie evolved into a genuine passion for the work being done there. He began volunteering his time, teaching financial literacy workshops, and mentoring young adults who aspired to start their own businesses. For the first time in years, Richard felt a deep sense of fulfillment that his corporate achievements had never provided.